The Sine Institute of Policy and Politics is American University's incubator for policy innovation. We convene leaders in the academic, public, private, nonprofit, and journalism sectors to engage and promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. In an evolving world, we seize the opportunity to work on the nation's most pressing challenges through collaboration by experts and top scholars in their field with students in research and scholarship. As part of that goal, the Sine Institute leverages American University's location in our nation's capital, the nexus of government and a growing international business center. We connect diverse perspectives from around the country and around the world with our world-class academics and research, experienced practitioners, and the most politically active student body in the U.S. We stand apart through our focus on the role of business and the nonprofit community in public policy, the rise of the importance of economic regions in the United States, and international policy issues. Our focus is to make an immediate impact at the intersection of policy and politics that leads to real and lasting change. Thank you for joining us as we convene, communicate, and collaborate. Introducing Sine Institute Fellow 2022, Richard Fontaine.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session in a series on national security at the Sine Institute at American University. I'm Richard Fontaine, a 2022 Sine Institute Fellow and the CEO of the Center for New American Security. The series is called Crafting National Security for Today and Tomorrow, and it's been focused on the chief forces that are driving the world today and how we should respond to them. Today is our final session, which will focus on the role of Congress in the making of foreign and national security policy, although we won't confine our conversation only to Congress's role, but rather to some of the issues themselves. For today's discussion, I'm really pleased to have with us Congressman Mike Gallagher. He is perhaps uniquely qualified to address these issues, and certainly is one of the most thoughtful and active members of Congress on the wide array of national security issues. Mike has represented Wisconsin's 8th District in the House of Representatives since 2017. He previously served 7 years on active duty in the Marine Corps, including 2 deployments to Iraq. He was the lead Republican staffer for the Middle East and Counterterrorism on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He serves on the House Armed Services Committee and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and also served for a couple of years as co-chair of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. And that was when he wasn't busy picking up numerous degrees in international affairs, including a PhD from Georgetown, which is a university apparently across town somewhere. Congressman, thank you for joining us. I know it's a busy time and you're right off the House floor and may have to run to go vote. So we're glad to have you share a little bit of your insights with us. Appreciate it.
It's an honor to be with you, Richard. I am a huge admirer of your work. And yeah, just for context, I'm in a little like phone booth type thing off the House floor. We're in the middle of a 4-vote series. So if at some point I have to go vote, that is if I disappear from the screen, it's because I'm voting.
So this is like the man on the spot equivalent of like somebody with the umbrella and like the hurricane behind them and stuff like that.
That's right, yeah. But I will keep this one AirPod in, so I'll be able to monitor. If you want to talk crap about me behind my back, I will hear it.
Okay, sounds good. All right, well, let me start. And if folks who are watching have questions, put them in the Q&A box, and I'll try to get to as many of them as I can as we have this discussion. Let me start off with kind of a big question. So, you know, a lot of folks who haven't worked in government sometimes will assume that the executive branch makes foreign policy, or the State Department makes foreign policy, or, you know, the president exclusively makes foreign and national security policy. But of course, Congress has a key role to play. So how do you see what that role should be, and how do you see what that role is?
Well, it should be constitutionally. I think we've sort of fallen away from the Platonic ideal. You know, obviously Congress has a role in authorizing the use of military force, declaring war, but as a function of its power of the purse, you can make an argument that Congress has a role in every aspect of foreign policy. Certainly, you know, in our day-to-day here in Congress, we primarily do 2 things. One, we authorize and the other is we appropriate. The first is basically telling the Department of Defense or the State Department what it can and can't do, expressing support for certain levels of budgeting, but the appropriations function involves actually giving those departments money for the things that we've authorized them to do. I would argue that particularly when it comes to war powers, we have surrendered most of our constitutional authority to the executive branch. A lot of this accelerated in the 70s with the passage of the War Power Resolution, as well as just change in the budgetary process as the Watergate babies came into Congress. Somewhat ironically and tragically, they tried to claw back authority, but it had basically the opposite effect in almost every situation. The last 20 years of counterterrorism operations operating under the same AUMF are probably the best example of that. So we've kind of strayed away from that, and I'll just sort of end by saying, as a consequence of that, a lot of what we do is not a matter on foreign policy, is not a matter of passing legislation. It's a matter of doing oversight. It's a matter of trying to ask serious questions in hearings so we can get to the bottom of what's happening, what's working, what isn't. And it's a matter of conducting investigations into certain foreign policy activities. So it's a mix of things. I'm a sort of an Article 1 Republican. I wish Congress would take a far more active role in U.S. foreign policy. But I just would say part of the reason it's so difficult is that, for example, me sitting on the Armed Services Committee, and I came into that role with a little bit of experience in military issues, having served myself. But it would take a far bigger staff and 24 hours of the day, every single day, to really do effective oversight of something like the Department of Defense, which is just so massive. So Congress is sort of at a institutional disadvantage relative to, and a resource disadvantage relative to the agencies that we're supposed to authorize, fund, and conduct oversight of, which magnifies the problem we have in the current Congress. If that makes sense at all.
Yeah, and I think what you said about the informal tools available to Congress to influence or change or affect foreign policy and national security is absolutely critical, because, again, one of the sort of pieces of conventional wisdom, I think, is, well, if you want to get something done, you got to pass a law in order to do it. Well, no, often you don't. There's not going to be a law passed on that, and that's especially true when it comes to things that are more susceptible to oversight and things like that. But you're also, well, let me ask you this. So you are probably the most, or certainly one of the most active members on national security issues. But the world's a big place. There's a lot of issues out there. DOD is a big place. The State Department's a big place. You're on the Intel committee. The intelligence community is a big place. How do you decide what to focus on, what issues to focus on, so as not to spread yourself thin and ineffective across the whole variety of those?
Well, this kind of relates to what I said about sort of, I have a staff of about 14 people. Half of those are in my district, just doing constituent services. Of the 7 that are here in DC, only 2 are doing foreign policy. So it's me and 2 other people, which if it's true that I'm one of the most active members on national security foreign policy, perhaps that's a stunning indictment of the modern Congress. And I fear for the future of the Republic. But the best piece of advice when I, as a function of that, when I came into Congress, the best piece of advice I got was from then Speaker Paul Ryan. He said, you can't be a generalist. You really have to be ruthless in terms of your specialty. You can't do everything, right? You can't be the healthcare guy and the foreign policy guy. You really have to be ruthless and disciplined in what you focus on. And for me, this was interesting because I came into office with a background in Middle Eastern studies. I was an Arabist, I was an Arabic linguist. I had done Middle East stuff both in the military and when I was a staff on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But it quickly became apparent to me that the biggest challenge we were dealing with was China. And so I had to spend a lot of my first 2 years in Congress educating myself on a region of the world where I hadn't spent as much time, challenging myself to write about that. And I really think, as I think about it now, my focus areas, it's all viewed through the prism of US-China competition. And I try and select 3 or so areas where I can really focus on a particular aspect of that competition. And I try and limit myself to that. So one has been cyber, and I was fortunate to serve as co-chair of the Cyber Solarium Commission, which was a great experience. Another has been sea power issues in particular. If you look at a map of the Indo-Pacific, you'll be struck by one thing, which is that there's a lot of blue on that map indicating water, which means we need to figure out a way to sort of modernize and rebuild and increase the size of our Navy. And a lot of the fight over Taiwan will be kind of a maritime focused fight. And so I spent a lot of my time thinking about the future of the Navy and the Marine Corps. And now sort of the third thing added to that is, because I'm the ranking member of the Military Personnel Subcommittee, I'm trying to think through, when it comes to our war games, our war colleges and our war gaming process, as well as just the overall way in which we manage military careers, are we doing enough to prepare the next generation of warfighters to be ready for that fight? So that's sort of how I think about it in my mind. That's not to say I don't get distracted by other things. I wrote a 5,000 word article that no one read on education reform in Wisconsin last year, and my staff is continually frustrated as I get distracted by, like, the dog from Up, by squirrels that run by. But I try and stay focused on those three things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you look at Congress's role in the process, and I think it was your Atlantic article a couple of years ago that laid out all kinds of things that could be done if Congress was to take that role more seriously.
I'm just going to be looking at the time, the clock, okay? But you can keep asking your question.
Okay, this is the life of a member of Congress.
I will. This is more interesting for your millions of viewers than a standard thing with a virtual background. So probably in about 4 minutes, I'll have to go vote.
Okay, so when you look at, from your own experience or from history, areas where Congress has worked particularly well or particularly poorly on national security matters?
Yeah, a few stand out. Well, particularly poorly, I just would say the overall budgetary dysfunction in Congress has done enormous damage to our foreign policy. I think the former Secretary of the Navy, Spencer, said, and this is just a small amount in the Navy context, said because of continuing resolutions and budget uncertainty, the Navy put $4 billion, and this was in one fiscal year, into a trash can, lit it on fire. I think Mattis at one point said, we've done more damage to our own military than any enemy in the field could have hoped to do. So just the overall dysfunction of the budget process, the divide between authorizers and appropriators, which goes back to the days of John Quincy Adams, I think makes absolutely no sense. And I'm an advocate for actually collapsing the authorizing committees, the appropriating committees into the authorizing committees, because the skill set that would make you an effective authorizer are the same that would make you an effective appropriator. It's just knowledge of and oversight of what an executive branch agency is doing. So that's probably the biggest source of dysfunction. I think it's also maybe, though I don't subscribe to this idea that politics stopped at the water's edge in the Cold War and that we all kind of joined hands and agreed on everything. I just don't think that's historically accurate at all. I'm happy to get into that debate. I do think foreign policy has become very politicized as everything's gotten politicized. We sort of have a resurgence of isolationism within my own party. And again, that's not new, that there's a long history of that in the Republican Party, but it's in a way, I think some of the cultural domestic fights have infected foreign policy fights, if that makes sense. And that's been most dysfunctional. And the third area of dysfunction I alluded to before, I just think we've completely abdicated our war powers function. And the fact that we have not been able to seriously repeal and revise the 2001 AOMF, I think is a stunning indictment of Congress. I'd be curious your thoughts based on your experience too, Richard. On the positive side, I've made the argument that we're in the early stages of a new Cold War. I know we probably disagreed about that terminology. I think it's a useful sort of analogy, both for the similarities and differences that it illuminates. But if you look back to that time period, basically 48 through, I would say all the way through the 50s, I mean, just remarkable stories of members of Congress from different parties coming together and just figuring out this new problem, figuring out how to build a new national security bureaucracy that didn't work, and figuring out what the right level of military funding was, right? Because the sentiment after World War II was we bring the boys home, We had a hollow force that got quickly exposed as being hollow in the Korean War. And, suddenly the Truman administration has to aggressively adjust course. I'd argue it went overboard. Eisenhower kind of got it right afterwards. But that, I think, initiated a series of process where we've had multiple successes throughout the Cold War. We were able to at least to learn from failure. I'm obsessed with a forgotten hero of history called Andrew Goodpaster. And he, at various points, engaged Congress to prevent them from cutting NATO in half, for example. So my hope is that as much as foreign policy has always been subject to, I'm going to have to go vote, to partisan debates and has not been, it's not stopped at the water's edge. I just hope that in faced with this new challenge from China, men and women of good faith on both sides of the aisle can come together honestly and just have a debate about, okay, what do we need to do? Is what we're doing working or is it not working? And thus far, I don't think we're having that debate. I think we're complacent, particularly when it comes to the role of technology in foreign policy going forward. I just think we're not where we need to be. And because your average member of Congress is just so distracted, as I'm proving right now, it's hard to get people in a room together to have an open and honest debate because they spend so much time posing for the camera. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to vote and I'm going to come back. We'll continue this conversation.
Go for it. And why it probably will take 4 or 5 minutes for the congressman to go vote. So if there are questions or thoughts that people want to put in the Q&A box, otherwise I will maybe keep up a little patter while so people don't who are tuned in here won't drop off. I think what Mike said about politics never stopping at the water's edge. I only spent 7 years of my life working in the Senate. It was only as a staffer, but I did get to see a lot of this in action working for Senator McCain and for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And, there is this kind of mythical, is that it? Are you back already? Oh, you're muted.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yeah, are you back already?
Yeah, I'm back already.
Oh my God, what an efficient voting mechanism. So what was the vote and how did you vote?
It was an amendment to another bill that we're doing. It had about 1,000 other amendments in it. So it was a hodgepodge of different things. That's another problem with the modern Congress is that these bills become so big and unwieldy that, which is why we might need a single subject amendment to the Constitution. I don't know. But what did I miss in my absence? I was trying to think of more positive examples of Congress working together. I would say, let me add this. I will say on the Armed Services Committee, we still do operate very much in a bipartisan manner. And every year we pass a National Defense Authorization Act. And while, perhaps that's not as important as actually sort of funding the Defense Department, there's a lot of very important stuff in there. And we've tried to force DOD to think hard about how we modernize in light of the China challenge. There's just been a lot of behind the scenes initiatives that haven't gotten as much press. And I would say in the cyber domain as well, the commission I referenced that I was on, my co-chair was a independent senator from Maine named Angus King. And, we got about 30 bills passed into law based on our final report. And so there are sort of areas where Congress continues to function, or at least tries to take foreign policy and national security pretty seriously.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, I was, while you were gone for 30 seconds, I was reinforcing the point that you made about politics never stopping at the water's edge. There seems to be this myth of the halcyon days of yore when, something would happen somewhere in the world, and no matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or a vegetarian or whatever, you just all sort of came to the same conclusion about exactly what should be done, and then it was unified and all this other stuff. And certainly external threats like we're seeing right now can bring people together in ways, hopefully, that are more productive rather than less. But it would stand to reason that politics continues in foreign policy just as it does in domestic policy. These are contested issues and contested solutions, and people, run on these things and things like that. And so, of all the things that we can wail and gnash our teeth about the demise of, politics stopping at the water's edge does not seem to me among them. So,
yeah, I would be like, just think of the period I referenced, right? I mean, you had. In the late 40s, you have a wave of domestic spying cases emerge. You have the Soviet nuclear test, which caught us by surprise in 1949. And everybody freaked out. The sky was falling. You had the invasion of Korea. It was all, and then Korea ends up being a massive issue in the 52 campaign. And I honestly, if you reread some of Eisenhower's stump speeches, including speeches he infamously gave in Wisconsin and failed to defend George Marshall adequately for fear of the first Marine intelligence officer ever elected to Congress from Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy, I being the second. They read as intensely partisan. Think about another great Wisconsinite, Mel Laird, Secretary of Defense. Him and Kissinger were using the national security, I guess this is inter-party, but they were using the national security bureaucracy to spy on each other constantly. Like we've had very intense debates and dysfunctional processes related to foreign policy in the past. But the key is that we sort of learn over time from our mistakes. And I worry that we're not doing that right now.
Well, you mentioned the intra-party political and policy disputes. I mean, what is Republican foreign policy right now? Is there one?
What is Republican foreign policy? So I think the basic orientation of the Republican Party remains one of peace through strength. I mentioned that there is sort of an isolationist wing within the party, but that goes back a long way. And I think there's a lot of people that would like to see reform within the Defense Department, particularly when it comes to personnel reform and personnel costs and things like that. But in general, I think Republicans are, the overwhelming majority of Republicans are united around the basic idea that for diplomacy to work, for our soft power to be effective, it needs to be backed by hard power. And I think we're getting a lesson in that right now. In Ukraine, deterrence did fail, at least the threat of sanctions failed to deter Putin initially. And I would argue it failed because it wasn't backed by a credible threat of military force, or at least hard power on the ground in Ukraine that would have been sufficient to deter Putin from invading. Now, Putin seems to be getting more than he bargained for, but so that's point one. Point two, on the question of allies, there's been a lot of controversy within the party about whether our allies in general and our NATO allies in particular are doing enough. I think while we might quibble over the rhetoric used to criticize allies here or there, the idea that we should be pushing NATO members to do more, that we should be pushing NATO to not just think in terms of inputs, i.e. whether every member state is meeting its 2% goal, but more in terms of output, whether those inputs are actually buying the systems we need to effectively deter Russia from invading the Baltics or destabilizing NATO in other ways by denial, whether all our different weapon systems are interoperable and work with each other. I think most Republicans are behind that idea. And put differently, the idea that we want to invest and back allies, lethal allies that are willing to invest in their own combat credibility. And I think in other regions of the world, particularly in the Middle East, I think the basic framework laid down by the Abraham Accords is one that Republicans have, there's overwhelming support within the party for, and then a general recognition in Indo-PACOM that we need to do more, particularly when it comes to helping Taiwan defend itself and turning Taiwan into a porcupine. I just think there's a lot of areas of agreement. I'm not trying to minimize the issue. There are divisive issues, to be sure, and there are extreme fiscal hawks in the party that don't want to give DOD any more money and believe most of that money is wasted. I got it, but by and large, I think we're still kind of rowing our oars in the same direction, if that makes sense. But you tell me what areas you think are most divisive, and I can respond to that.
Well, trade is obviously.
Trade.
I mean, that either I mean, that's divisive across the political spectrum. You don't have the normal camps that you once did really on that, nor I think the core beliefs about the utility of trade in our foreign policy. The idea of this has lost some steam after Afghanistan, but the need to end the forever wars picked up steam in both parties, including Republicans who in a previous generation probably would have had a different position on that. My view is that was more rhetorical than anything, but nevertheless, that was in there. So, there's some contested areas, but I think, some of the issues big issues you mentioned are a thread that runs through the most of the party.
Well, and then there's sort of this kind of China first argument that's taken hold, right? That we don't have the luxury of sort of, dealing with, maybe this is an unfair characterization, but that we need to be wary of further involvement in Eastern Europe because we have to focus all of our resources in the Indo-Pacific. I don't agree with that view, but that's certainly one that has credible advocates within the party. On trade, it's interesting though. I think you need to make a distinction between. I think there were a lot of people that were very supportive of more aggressive trade actions, the so-called 301 tariffs against China, but skeptical about the 232 tariffs, which were the national security tariffs on steel and aluminum, which largely affected our allies. And my argument throughout had been, well, you can pick a trade fight with China or allies. You can't do both simultaneously. And in order to be effective economically against China, you're going to have to bring our allies along for the ride. So even that issue is complex. Or there's a lot of people I think would be welcoming of a series of bilateral trade agreements in the Indo-Pacific, even if they're skeptical of reviving a large multilateral trade agreement like the Trans-Pacific Partnership or whatever the current name for it is. So, but you're absolutely right. That issue stands out, as well as the endless wars issue. But I wonder if we didn't arrive at a workable path in between sort of, and these are characters of both sides, right? On the one hand, you have the endless wars crowd, and then you have the so-called neocons. I've been accused of being one in the past. In both Iraq, Afghanistan, and I would argue in some cases Syria, through a process of painful trial and error, we actually sort of arrived at a workable middle ground, which is that you identify allies and partners on the ground that you can work with. They're doing the majority of the fighting. U.S. forces are acting as enablers, and for a small investment and a light footprint, you can achieve a big impact, and which is, I think, one of the best arguments that we should have maintained a small residual force in Afghanistan. And I think a lot of Americans would be sympathetic to that argument when done the right way.
I totally agree with you. And I think the evidence of that is what did happen in Afghanistan and what has not happened in the areas of Syria where we still have a presence, and has not happened in Iraq where we have a presence, as contrasted to what happened in Iraq when we did pull out all of the troops in 2011 and saw ISIS build the biggest terrorist sanctuary in human history. And we had to go back in and fight it off at fairly big expense to the United States. We've wobbled our way to a sustainable model here.
That's right. So the ISIS leader we just took out, that was not an over the horizon counterterrorism operation. Like, we had assets on the ground, right? And we had intelligence on the ground, which is something we're not going to have in Afghanistan, having precipitously pulled out. I think this over the horizon counterterrorism is a myth that's being sold to us by the Biden administration. I think it's going to have pretty damaging consequences over the long term.
Well, the other problem with over the horizon approach, so one is efficacy, but the other is resource intensity. The whole point of withdrawing from Afghanistan was to be able to reduce our costs in every way, shape, and form, reduce the amount of resources we were pouring into Afghanistan so that we could free that up to do things in other places that supposedly had more importance. But if you are continuing to conduct counterterrorism operations in Afghanistan, you're just doing it from the Gulf rather than Afghanistan itself.
That's right.
You certainly haven't saved resources, and you may have increased what's necessary.
You've, I need to check my vote situation. Are we still in the second vote? How much time? 11? Yeah. Can you tell me with 3? Yeah, thanks. Sorry, this is very elegant the way we're doing this.
No, this is good. This is good.
Sounding incoherent as a result. Well, you're also stressing the precise forces that you need in a China fight, right? Like, we had to reroute naval assets to the Middle East that we wouldn't have needed there, that are necessary in a China fight because of that. And so, I think it will. And I think to get to sort of the China first argument, you got to ask yourself, like, what will consume more military resources or consume more readiness? Us occasionally having to send some ships to the Black Sea to aggressively work with the Ukrainians on the ground to provide them with lethal assistance, or this conflict absolutely spiraling out of control, consuming all of our bandwidth and thereby undermining our ability to shift resources to the Indo-Pacific. I think there's a danger of if you go too aggressive in the direction of a minimalist posture in Europe and vis-a-vis Russia, you could create, because deterrence will collapse in that theater, you could undermine deterrence in another theater. And I think it's fair to say, if nothing else, that the leadership in China, Xi Jinping in particular, is watching the current crisis in Ukraine unfold, taking notes, and I personally believe that if anything, sort of expedites his timeline for making a move on Taiwan. But I guess reasonable people can disagree about that.
Yeah, but I think you're totally right about this China-focused thing. It seems to me that the price of placing China and Asia as our top long-term priorities are to avoid acute crises in other regions to which no American president would do nothing, right? So it's just not conceivable that if ISIS, I mean, Obama wanted to pivot to Asia, but and didn't want to be in the Middle East, but when ISIS created a huge terrorist sanctuary, no American president's going to ignore that and say it doesn't matter, right? Same thing with Putin's aggression and things like that. And so, you have to try to avoid these flashpoints in other places, or you'll never get to the long-term thing just by the nature of our global interests and our politics. So in a way, Putin is teaching us right now how to pivot sustainably to the Indo-Pacific, which means that you have to have a presence and probably some increased presence in Europe. So
I agree with that.
Let me, oh, do you need to go vote? I was going to ask you.
No, I can probably do one more and
okay.
then vote and come back. Yeah.
Okay. So we got some questions here from the audience and from students. So Chaitanya is a sophomore in the School of International Service. She asked, considering your own interests and intellectual pursuits, is there a need for congressmen and women to have a strong educational and intellectual background to be good political representatives and effective legislatures, maybe even educational requirements? Now, I will note again that you have your bachelor's from Princeton, not one, but two master's degrees and a PhD in international relations at Georgetown. So what do you say to the people who you deal with on some of these issues that lack any sort of background educationally or otherwise? Or you say, hey, look, common sense is common sense.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it requires a PhD to truly be effective in Congress. Now, it was a valuable experience for me, probably less for the political science and more for the history aspect of it. I guess the basic awareness of both quantitative and qualitative methods allows me to kind of dig into some of the stats that the Defense Department likes to cite, which are usually based on garbage social science, and maybe be a little bit more effective at my oversight role. But I don't think it requires a bunch of graduate degrees. I think the experience that's probably far more valuable and relevant to my service in Congress is that I had in the military, both because that's really where I took the book knowledge and my language skills and I put them into practice, and also where I just learned to kind of work with teams to get a difficult job done, which is kind of what Congress is all about at the end of the day. That being said, I do think there's some ways where we can better educate members. There shouldn't be an education requirement, but we're sort of exploring this idea of, could you come up with a mini curriculum for members on national security committees like Armed Services, Intel, partner with a university and kind of give people, when it comes to like next generation technology, AI, ML, quantum, things like that, which, I barely understand. And I don't have time to go get a graduate degree on it. Like, could you have a crash course and that stuff? That might be interesting. But at the end of the day, I think like the vision that the framers had in mind, which was people would come and serve in Congress from all different walks of life. Some could have a military background, some could have a private sector background, God forbid, some could be lawyers. Unfortunately, that's been the case throughout most of American history. Some could be academics. I still think that's a beautiful vision. And you don't want to start like optimizing for one particular specialty or the others. Right now, I think it's very valuable to be a veteran running for office. We are recruiting a ton of veterans, and I think a lot of those people are going to come in and be able to hit the ground running and have a huge impact. And so while I think that's valuable, I guess someone else can make an argument that we need more former CEOs in Congress. The thing that I think is dangerous, no matter what you think the right profile for a member of Congress is when people stay here for too long. I don't think it was meant to be a career. I think that model the framers had in mind was one of the citizen legislator. And so I worry that for too many people, their only experience is politics, or they've gone from local office to federal office and they're here for 30 years. That to me just doesn't seem like the right approach. But I just would say for anyone who is interested in a career in foreign policy, whether it takes you to Congress or it takes you to the executive branch or it takes you to a nonprofit, I think there's value in developing deep regional expertise, I guess, or functional expertise. But I think you can become a generalist later in your career, but particularly in your 20s, that's a time to really carve out a niche where you can go really deep. For me, that was Arabic in the Middle East. And obviously now I'm doing China and technology, so go figure. But that was kind of that was like my union card in the foreign policy community. So I just think, and I think we do a bad job in the executive branch, particularly in the military, of allowing people to develop that deep expertise because we're rotating people every 2 or 3 years. So that's kind of a tangent, but that's related. Let me go vote real quick and then I'll come back.
All right.
Let me just.
And then we will get to, in our remaining 15 minutes or whatever we'll get to Tyler's question and Rand's question. Rand has 2 questions here. One of the things for those who are thinking about careers in international affairs and foreign policy is that the possibilities are often much greater than one assumes when you're getting your degree. I figured if you want to do foreign policy, you graduate and join the Foreign Service. And of course, plenty of people do that, and it's a great career there. But there's the intelligence community, there is working on the Hill. Even if you don't get yourself elected, most members have a foreign policy or a national security or both staffer. Then there are the committees, there are think tanks, and plenty of places inside government that you wouldn't think about. NASA has an international affairs office, and the Department of Commerce has a foreign commercial service, and the Department of Agriculture has a foreign agricultural service, and so on and so on and so on and so on and so on. So there's a lot of really interesting possibilities in government and around government. Of course, that's before you even get to the private sector or the kind of NGOs that are active on humanitarian issues or things like that. So, and the opportunity, especially these days, is to have a career that touches way more than 1 or 2 of those areas. You can have a career broadly in international relations, having spent some time in government, in the think tank world, or in the private sector, and things like that, and sort of come back. So.
Okay, I'm back, but it's noisier because I lost my my phone booth. It's ruthless in here. People just kind of pounce and steal your place. So hopefully, when I'm not talking, I'm going to mute. But I'm back in action here. So.
You're good. It's not very noisy at all coming through, so you're good. All right. So another question. This is from Rand about. Do you think the U.S. has not been supportive enough of Sunnis in Iraq and Afghanistan, and is that part of our problem?
That's interesting. Well, I spent about 2 years of my life working with Sunni tribes in Western Iraq. I think you'd have to distinguish between Iraq and Afghanistan. I think we haven't had like a Sunni specific policy in the region, nor should we. Now, that being said, if you zoom out and you look sort of across the whole region, I think what's most interesting and kind of related to what I said about the Abraham Accords earlier is we have sort of a historic level of cooperation, both overt and behind the scenes, between our Sunni Arab Gulf allies and Israel right now. Now, there's some fractures and fault lines within the Gulf states, particularly between Qatar and some other states. And then there are some fault lines between some of our closest allies, the UAE and ourselves, relating to China. But by and large, like that's a framework we can build off of. And so, and this is where sort of, I think, part of your question may be true. I think the problem, at least during the Obama administration, and what I worry about with this administration, is there's going to be an effort to rehabilitate the Iran deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which all of our Sunni Arab allies in the region will view, as well as Israel, will view as a massive threat. It will destabilize the region. It will mess up the progress we've made under the Abraham Accords. And the only way for me to make sense of the region right now is to build an alliance structure in opposition to Iran's malign regional influence. And by enabling Iran, I guess that would be the way in which we haven't worked closely enough with our Sunni allies on the ground, particularly in Iraq, who, there are lingering concerns about the extent to which the Iranian government has infiltrated the Iraqi government, the role of Iranian proxies on the ground in Iraq, Shiite militias, things like that. So I think the best way we could support Sunni allies on the ground is having a clear-eyed view of Iran, not trying to revive the nearly lifeless corpse of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and figuring out a way to revive maximum pressure combined with building out the Abraham Accords, if that makes sense.
So I was going to ask you about the JCPOA. So we'll take you out of the undecided category on that one. And you don't believe that the desiccated corpse or the
I said the lifeless corpse.
The lifeless corpse. But I mean, the Trump administration got out of the JCPOA. They put on maximum pressure, and Iran increased its uranium enrichment activities. So would maximum pressure not elicit the same and continuing danger from increased uranium enrichment activities, or do you have some thought of something that's even more pressure than the Trump administration would do, and the Iranians would sort of cave in the face of it and just stop their efforts to enrich uranium?
Double maximum pressure. You heard it here first. I'm pointing that quick. Well, first, let me just step back and say, this deal that I think we may see emerge in the next 2 days. I'm now on 1% of power too, so everything's going wrong in this Zoom meeting with you, Richard. So if my phone is plugged in right now, so I don't know what's happening. I'm not trying to dodge this question. It's going to be much worse than the 2015 Iran deal. It's going to be more generous to the Iranian regime. We're going to be rolling back all sorts of sanctions that have nothing to do with Iran's nuclear program and everything to do with their support for terrorism, their ballistic missile program. And oh, by the way, a lot of the provisions in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the sunset provisions, are already in the rearview mirror. And the most important of which, or the overall majority of which, completely expire in 2025. So the game has changed. And I think any deal that is less restrictive on Iran's nuclear program than the 2015 deal is a non-starter. Okay, maximum pressure did not solve the Iranian nuclear program, but it did take their accessible cash reserves down to like $4 billion. And it's a counterfactual. We'll never know as to whether, if we continue the maximum pressure campaign, if it would have forced the Iranian regime to change course. They were dealing with at least 2 years of persistent protests in their own country, a massive blunder in the form of shooting down their own commercial airplane after the Soleimani standoff. I think part of the criticism of maximum pressure, at least as applied by the previous administration, had less to do with the economic maximum pressure and more to do with the fact that we didn't actually couple that with a coherent military and diplomatic strategy to push back on Iran's malign influence throughout the rest of the region. And it's related to the Ukraine situation in that I think that, and I don't mean to yell, there's a lot of chatter here. I think both parties have become too casual in their use of economic sanctions in the last 2 decades. It's like the easiest tool in our kit that we like to use when we don't want to actually contemplate more difficult military options or covert options, right? It's like sanctions allow you to feel like you're doing something without having to grapple with the harder issues. And I think we put too many of our eggs in the basket of a sanctions only strategy. And maybe that's a point that goes to your point of maximum pressure if it's not coupled with something a bit more aggressive. And I'm not saying you're advocating for this, but some sort of effort to support those resisting the regime within Iran, to maintain, if not increase, our presence on the ground throughout the region, it's not going to be successful on its own.
Okay, last question, and then we're going to let you get back to the people's work here, and all that you do on behalf of the people of Wisconsin, among others. And this is a question from some of the students. I think we're getting a hint of this, but what is daily life like as a member of Congress? What is it? What is it that you do during the course of an average day?
Total chaos, as you're seeing right now. I will say this is unusually chaotic, but a lot of my day is just spent juggling all like the competing demands of votes and hearings. I've already had 3 hearings today. The one I was the ranking member of a hearing prior to votes where I had to run, take the first vote, run back here, and then get into that cubicle so I could Zoom call you. So it's pretty crazy when you're in session. I would say in general, the battle rhythm of the day when you're in session is that in the morning you have committee work. So that's usually a hearing. I had a transportation hearing today, I had an intel hearing, and I had an armed services committee hearing. Maybe a few meetings in the morning with constituents. And then throughout the afternoon, you have votes and you have a variety of constituent meetings in your office. And then at night, there's usually, a dinner event. And that could either be an official one. So tonight I'm going to an embassy function for one of our closest allies to have a discussion about defense-related issues, or it could be a political event, because particularly one of the challenges in the House is you're up for election every 2 years. And so a lot of members have to spend a lot of their time raising money. I'm lucky right now where I'm not, my race isn't that difficult, but there are some very expensive races out there where people have to spend at least half their time, if not more, doing political work. Now, when you're back in your district, it's different. Like I spend almost none of my time in my office in my district, and most of my time just going all over Northeast Wisconsin, meeting with businesses, meeting with constituents, touring facilities, just kind of talking to people and, figuring out what's going on and what their concerns are. So it's a mix of different things, which means, and to get to one of your earlier questions, you have to be very, very, okay, I have some time here. You have to be very disciplined in carving out time to read, both classified and unclassified, carving out time to write. For me personally, the only way I can organize my thoughts is if I try and put it down on paper. So every morning I carve out an hour before anything else to do writing. And it may not mean that bit of writing ends up in an op-ed or a journal article, but it at least helps me to kind of like, think through some issues. I could just be working on talking points. Oh, and that gets to the other thing. And this is something that took me a while to get comfortable with. A lot of what you're doing, and I would argue this is actually an essential part of your oversight function, is you have to communicate via media on various issues. And so a lot of what I'm doing throughout the day is going to do an interview with a TV show or a radio show or a podcast, usually talking about some foreign policy issue. And at first I really resisted that. I didn't like the idea of being sort of like a C-list pundit. But I've come to just believe that is part of the job. And I've tried to improve my ability to communicate on TV, which can be difficult if you particularly if you come from sort of a policy and academic background. It's very hard to distill your thinking into like a 30-second soundbite, particularly when you're dealing with very complex issues that aren't really solvable in a soundbite, if that makes sense.
Makes total sense. As a think tanker, every time I get invited to, I don't know, go on CNN or something like that, the last thing they want to hear in response to the question is, it's complicated. They don't want, nobody wants to hear that. They want to hear like, kill them, or, what's the answer?
That's right. Yeah. The problem is, just blame the other party, depending on what channel you're on. A quick story on that, which actually does, I guess, prove the value of getting a graduate degree. I once went on Morning Joe in my freshman year. And so for a Republican, Morning Joe was not a friendly environment, particularly during the Trump administration. So every question was about Trump. And if memory serves, I got asked a question about Trump had said something positive about Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader of North Korea. And we were having this debate about whether to maintain troops on the Korean Peninsula. And so they asked me about it, and they said something effective. Well, if you don't support getting rid of troops on the Korean Peninsula, aren't you getting in trouble with Trump by disagreeing with him? And like, aren't you afraid of the president coming after you? And I didn't really know how to answer the question. So I accessed the only thing I remember from my PhD work, which is I said, actually, there's well-established literature in the political science community on the nature of two-level games. And it actually improves the president's ability to negotiate with North Korea if he can point to Congress and say, listen, there are members of Congress constraining my ability to act here. So I actually think by disagreeing with the president on this issue, I'm improving his ability to achieve a diplomatic resolution to the crisis over North Korea's nuclear program. And then, thankfully, the time for the interview ran out, so they couldn't ask me any follow-up questions. So that was my only successful use of academic gobbledygook in the political environment.
Oh, that's awesome. That is awesome. All right. Well, Congressman Mike Gallagher, thank you so much for the time, especially on such a hectic day. We really benefited from your insights. Really appreciate this. And thank you for what you've done. And thank you for being with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for doing this. Thanks for rolling with the punches here with the voting schedule. And sorry if it was a bit chaotic, but you got a true insight into what it's like to be a member of Congress, I guess.
Absolutely. This is like keeping up with the Kardashians, Congressman Gallagher style. So this is reality at its best. And I hope that everyone really appreciates the service you've done for us all. So, all right. Thanks, Mike. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah.